All right, let's jump right in. Today, we are taking a deep, top-down look at how the world's most successful institutions actually deal with uncertainty. We're going to completely demystify risk management, and we're going to look at it not as some necessary evil or compliance headache, but as a seriously dynamic engine for creating real value.
Okay, let's dive into this because this quote from our source material just completely shatters the biggest myth out there. Look, most people think risk management is just about, minimizing loss or running away from danger. But think about it. A company that shies away from all risk literally wouldn't be able to operate. It's exactly like a diet. Your body absolutely needs calories to function and grow, right? Well, a business needs to take risks to generate returns. So risk management is really about actively understanding and embracing those chosen risks to hit your goals. So here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start by fundamentally redefining risk management, then map out the framework, step right into the boardroom for risk governance, break down how we set tolerances and budgets, look at how we measure those risks, and finally, figure out how to actively modify them. Let's kick things off with Section 1, redefining risk management, and how it's really all about maximizing value. Because taking carefully chosen risks, that is the core recipe for business success. Now, the absolute key word here is enterprise. Enterprise risk management, or ERM, demands that we look at the entire economic balance sheet of a business, not just isolated one-off assets. Picture a pension fund manager for a second. If they're only trying to maximize the fund's assets by buying super volatile equities, they are completely ignoring the liability side of things, the actual payouts they owe to retirees. ERM forces the whole organization to step back and consider how every single risk interacts and impacts the health of the entire entity. It's the big picture. Moving right along to Section 2, let's examine the risk management framework. Think of this as the blueprint, the essential infrastructure that supports every good decision a company makes. And the way all these pieces fit together is just brilliant. It all starts at the top with risk governance, where the board defines the overarching goals. Those goals then dictate the risk tolerance and the risk budgeting. That high-level guidance flows directly to management in the center, and they're the ones allocating capital to execute the strategies. And to support all of this, you've got the infrastructure, identifying, measuring, and monitoring the risks. It's a continuous, ongoing loop. If the risk exposures suddenly fall out of line with what the board tolerates, well, management has to step right in and modify them. Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, risk governance and the enterprise view. Let's step into the boardroom where the captains of the ship actually operate. It is incredibly vital to separate governance from execution. They are not the same thing. The board of directors sits at the governance level. They're the ones determining the overarching goals, defining the value drivers, and explicitly spelling out the organization's risk appetite. They essentially say, here's the worst-case scenario we can live with. Management, on the flip side, is tasked with the actual execution. They take those boundaries set by the board and go out into the market to select the specific strategies and investments that will maximize value without crossing those red lines. So, what does a strong risk governance framework actually look like? Well, it has some very specific hallmarks. It absolutely includes active risk oversight and a clearly defined risk tolerance. But to make sure the whole enterprise stays aligned day in and day out, good governance formally appoints a chief risk officer, a CRO, and establishes a dedicated risk management committee. This gives the company a regular operational forum to guarantee that their daily activities are staying strictly consistent with the board's top-level guidance. Let's transition into Section 4, risk tolerance and budgeting. This is where the rubber meets the road, how the board's high-level philosophy gets translated into hard, actionable limits. Overall risk tolerance is actually a combination of two very different factors, and you really need to understand both. First, there's the ability to bear risk. This is highly objective. It depends on concrete mathematical factors like your time horizon and your wealth. An investor with a 20-year time horizon inherently has a higher ability to bear risk than someone needing their money in 2 years, simply because they have more time to ride out market drops. But then you have to contrast that with the willingness to take risk. And this is entirely subjective and psychological. It's about an individual's or even a whole corporate culture's attitude toward uncertainty. You literally have to evaluate both that objective ability and the subjective willingness to find your true, overarching risk tolerance. Once that tolerance is set, we move to risk budgeting. Risk budgeting is how you allocate that tolerable risk across the organization. It's the bridge from the high-level governance decision straight down to management's daily choices. And what makes this so incredibly powerful is that it forces a culture of evaluating the return per unit of risk for every single decision. Look, if your budget is strictly capped, you are naturally pushed to only select the projects that offer the absolutely highest reward for the specific amount of risk they eat up.
Now let's see how this builds into Section 5, identifying and measuring risks. We are taking this from the board's theoretical budget right down to the analyst's dashboard. Because to measure risk, you obviously have to identify it first. We generally divide risks into two big buckets. Financial risks arise directly from the financial markets, things like sudden market movements, credit defaults, or a total lack of liquidity. Non-financial risks, however, come from inside the organization or the external environment. Think operational failures, solvency issues, settlement errors, or sudden changes in regulations. A truly robust risk infrastructure has to track both because, and this is key, they very often interact and compound each other. To actually quantify these exposures, analysts use a specific toolkit of metrics. They might use standard deviation to measure overall volatility or beta to look at risk relative to the broader market. But they also desperately need to look at the extremes, which is where scenario analysis and stress testing come into play. This is how they see if a portfolio could actually survive historical crashes or massive hypothetical adverse events. And finally, there is VAR, or value at risk, which is a massive cornerstone in the industry. So, the crucial point here is understanding how to actually read a metric like VAR. Let's use an example straight from the text. If an organization has a one-day 5% value at risk of $1 million, what does that actually mean in plain English? It means there is a 5% probability that the portfolio will lose more than $1 million in a single day. It's a statistical way to confidently quantify a minimum loss boundary for a specific time frame. All right, that brings us to our final section, modifying and managing risk. Once you've measured the risk, how do you actively adjust your exposures to align with your tolerance? Let's talk about taking action. Organizations basically have 5 distinct methods to modify their risk. 1, they can try to prevent it with tighter internal processes and controls. 2, they can avoid it entirely by simply refusing to engage in a risky business line. 3, they can intentionally accept it, deciding, hey, the potential return here is well worth the exposure. Or they can hand that risk off to someone else entirely through either transfer or shifting. Now, handing off risk is fascinating because there is a very nuanced difference between transferring it and shifting it. Transferring risk generally relies on the concept of pooling, like buying an insurance policy. The insurer takes on your risk because they pool it with thousands of other people, diversifying their own exposure. Shifting risk, however, typically uses financial instruments like derivatives. You are paying another party to directly take on a specific financial risk, changing your exposure curve without necessarily relying on a massive insurance pool. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to reiterate the core philosophy here. Good risk management does not magically guarantee you won't lose money in a market crash. What it does is rigorously inform your decision-making process. In the industry, they call it the doctrine of no surprises. It's not about having a crystal ball and predicting the future perfectly. It's ensuring that if a massive shock happens, the impact on your portfolio was already quantified, considered, and budgeted for well in advance. The heavy lifting is done before the crisis ever hits. Which leaves us with this final thought. Think about your own portfolio or your own business decisions. Are you simply trying to avoid risk out of fear? Or have you established a framework to actively budget and manage it? Because as we've seen today, embracing the right risks in the right amounts is exactly how you maximize your true value. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.